Hello, my name is Steve Carney, and I'm the command historian at Arlington National Cemetery. I'm standing in front of Section 24, where 230 crew members who were killed during the explosion of the USS Maine are buried. Today, I'm going to talk briefly about the cemeterial response to the Maine's explosion and how and why these crew members are buried at Arlington National Cemetery. In the aftermath of the Maine's explosion, due to Spanish policy, burials had to be made within 24 hours. Therefore, the initial crew that were recovered in the aftermath of the disaster were quickly buried at the Colón Cemetery in Havana. Here we see images of several crew members from the initial recovery efforts lying in state at the City Hall in Havana. And in the second image, we see the funeral procession through the town on the way to Colón Cemetery on February 17th of 1898. During the remainder of the month of February, a total of 166 crew member remains were located and interred at the Colón Cemetery. This photo, taken later in 1898, shows the burial plot for the Maine crew. The casketed remains were buried in several grave sites around this cross, which read, "Victims of the Maine." Beginning in March, additional remains that were recovered were sent to Key West, Florida, rather than being interred in Havana. Captain Charles Sigsbee had complained earlier to the American Secretary of the Navy about the treatment of American remains that were recovered in mid-February, but he did not have the resources to move those remains to the U.S. for burial. As a result, however, by March, any additional remains that were located were sent for burial at the Key West Cemetery. This film shows the funeral procession and Navy escort of 9 crew members through the town of Key West on March 27th. All of the remains recovered after the end of February of 1898 were interred at the Key West Cemetery. However, all operations or searches for additional crew members' remains were suspended at the beginning of April. In total, 24 crew members were recovered in March of 1898 and were buried at Key West. In the cemetery, 2 of those 24 were known and are buried in individual grave sites. The remainder were all unknown. In these photos, we see one of the early burials at the cemetery and what the plot ended up looking like in about 1901, which included all of the grave sites as well as a memorial that was erected in honor of the Maine victims. After the peace treaty with Spain went into effect on April 11th, 1899, the United States government began to repatriate service members who fell overseas during the conflict to the United States at the government's expense, at no cost to the families. One of the reasons for this is another piece of Spanish policy was that no disinterments could be made for a certain number of years after a burial. So now that Spain no longer administered Cuba or the Philippines, that was no longer a concern. One of the early repatriations that occurred was of the original 166 crew members who had been interred in the Colón Cemetery during February of 1898. In total, 165 of those 166 crew members were brought to Arlington National Cemetery for burial on December 28th of 1899 in what we at the time was called the Maine section, but of course today we call Section 24. Disinterments were completed in the Colón Cemetery on December 17th of 1899, and the 151 caskets that were disinterred were sent towards Arlington. They arrived on December 27th and were guarded overnight, while the funeral service and burials were conducted then on December 28th. This is an image of our December 1899 monthly report on burials at ANC, and you can see that in total, 165 Maine victims were buried here that month. 63 were known and 102 were unknown. Of note, it's also interesting to see that at the time, there were 17,720 individuals interred at the cemetery. In order to commemorate the establishment of the Maine section and the 165 crew members that were interred there, an early memorial comprised of an anchor and 2 captured Spanish mortars was dedicated. During the late 19th and early 20th century, it was very common at ANC for a memorial to be dedicated when a new burial section was created. That, however, is not the end of the story of the burials at ANC. During the salvage operations of the Maine, the remains of an additional 65 crew members were recovered throughout 1911 and were kept under American guard at the Fortress of La Cabana in Havana. After making preparations, the casketed remains were brought to the pier in Havana on March 16th of 1912 and were sent to the Washington Navy Yard, where they arrived on March 23rd of 1912. Here we see images of the procession of the casketed remains to the pier in Havana, and then the disembarking off of the USS Birmingham at the Washington Navy Yard. After arriving at the Navy Yard, a funeral procession snaked through Washington, D.C., and ultimately to ANC. Along the way, a funeral service was held near the State, War, and Navy Department building, which today is the site of the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. After arriving at ANC, the final 65 service members of the Maine's crew were laid to rest and joined their 165 shipmates who had been buried in 1899. In this photo, we see the preparation of those grave sites in Section 24. And here is a modern view of Section 24 today, with all 230 crew members interred there. This daily burial log from ANC on March 23rd of 1912 shows the burial of the 65 remains in a total of 34 caskets. Arlington offers a unique perspective on the Spanish-American War. There really are no other sites in the United States that tell as comprehensive of a story as we do here. Not only are the USS Maine crew members interred here, but also soldiers, sailors, Marines, and nurses from the conflict are buried nearby. In addition to those grave sites, we also are a major site of commemoration and memorialization of the war. We have 5 individual memorials here dedicated to the conflict. 2 to the USS Maine, 1 to the war itself, 1 to the Rough Riders, and 1 to the Spanish-American War nurses. You can learn about all these connections between ANC and the conflict through our education program, which is available at education.arlingtoncemetery.mil.